Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. I am Elena Simone Tyler, Associate Pastor for Justice and Mission. And in my role here at Westminster, I get to work with our Social Justice Ministry team. The Social Justice Ministry team builds the social justice forums around a common theme every program year. And our theme this year is diving deeper so all will flourish. This theme builds on our heightened awareness of the systemic and critical issues affecting our community brought to greater attention in recent years, and most especially in the response to the murder of George Floyd. Through the forums, we learn about longstanding needs and become more prepared to support the flourishing of all members of our community. Curtis Paul DeYoung is the Chief Executive Officer of the Minnesota Council of Churches, whose 27 member communities include historic Black, mainline Protestant, Pentecostal, and Greek Orthodox denominations, as well as the Dakota Native American Presbytery. The council builds ecumenical and interfaith unity through working for racial and social justice. Before coming to the Minnesota Council of Churches, DeYoung previously served as the executive director of the faith-based racial justice organization, Community Renewal Society of Chicago. It's a unique programmatic combination of church-based community organizing, policy advocacy, and investigative journalism. Wonderful, wonderful organization. I'm biased being from Chicago. Curtis is an ordained minister in the Church of God. He consults and speaks internationally and has extensive relationship among activists and peacemakers in South Africa and the Holy Land. He is the author and editor of 12 books on racial justice, reconciliation, social justice activism, and cultural competency. With South African anti-apartheid activist Alan Bozak, Curtis co-authored Radical Reconciliation, Beyond Political Pietism and Christian Quietism, and his most recent book is Becoming Like Creoles, Living and Leading at the Intersections of Injustice, Culture, and Religion. For those who are in the room following Dr. DeYoung's presentation, please raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone so we can make sure that those who are joining us by live stream and also those in the room can hear your questions or comments. And for those attending via the live stream, please put your comments or questions into the live stream chat and we'll monitor it here in the Meisel room and offer those into the space. So please join me in welcoming Dr. DeYoung. My friend, Dr. DeYoung.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here this morning at Westminster. Council of Churches is not too far from here, and Westminster is one of our strongest partners, so I'm often in and out of here for various things. So it might start feeling a little bit like home, especially as things are opening up and we can get back in person more and more. So it's just good to be with you. I do want to thank Elena for the invitation to speak this morning. Elena and I have been friends for some time, and she was, before coming to Westminster, was on the pastoral staff at the church that I attend, Park Avenue United Methodist Church. So we were sad to see her go, but happy for you and happy for Elena. And we have the utmost regard for your pastor, Tim Hart Anderson, and this collective of downtown congregations that are doing such good work. And we're thankful for your partnership in a few ways. One, in our refugee resettlement work, which is going very strong right now with a change in administration. So in DC, and so we're rebuilding our program. And then we've had to accelerate that with the arrival of Afghan evacuees. And I know that you've helped settle one of those families, and so we're very much appreciative for that. And also for your partnership around our work around racial justice, which I will probably reference along the way, but Westminster was one of the first to line up with us along some foundations and community organizations to launch truth-telling, education, and reparations work on behalf of the council. So what I want to do today is share a bit about my own journey, just for a few minutes, and then we're going to relook at a definition of reconciliation, the New Testament definition, and then we will remember that we're in the midst of a racial reckoning here in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, and then we're going to come to the title, Reconciliation in a Racial Reckoning. So what does it mean to do reconciliation in such a time as this? So I was raised, there's no other way to say it, I was raised in whiteness. I was born in the northeast corner of Indiana. My father was a rural pastor in an area affectionately known as Amish country. We are not Amish, but much of the population was. And shortly thereafter, we moved to a suburban environment near Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I was raised in the suburbs, white suburbs. My graduating class from high school was 99% white and heavily Dutch in that part of the country. The college I went to was not much more diverse. It was a Christian undergraduate institution in Indiana. And I say all that to say is that to put the contrast on the work that I'm involved in now versus where I began, to me points to the possibility that all of us can journey in reconciliation work, and all of us can become more and more culturally competent in our journey. A couple things that helped along the way as I was raised in whiteness was there were these interruptions that gave me the opportunity to start to think outside of my own frame of reference and my own context. When I was 12 years old, Martin Luther King had been assassinated a couple years earlier. No one in the northern white suburbs even noticed. Really, it didn't affect our life. I have a slight memory of John Kennedy's assassination, which was 5 years prior to Dr. King. The school was canceled, and it came into my consciousness as a kindergartner. But by the time Dr. King was assassinated in the white suburbs of the north, like I said, we didn't even notice. So 2 years after he was assassinated, my father and I were watching a public television special called From Montgomery to Memphis, and it was the activist life of King, and it was all news clips with commentary. And I was shocked in my little bubble to discover what was really going on in our country. And as a 12-year-old, I began to find every biography on Martin Luther King that I could find, every LP album of his speeches that I could find, and began to educate myself on King and the civil rights movement and the issues around poverty that King exposed as a part of the movement. Doing all of this in a very white context. In fact, whenever I had a chance to write a term paper in high school, I'd write it on Martin Luther King, and my teachers were, I guess, befuddled is the best term to use as to why I would even be interested in that. Nonetheless, and I went to college, again, a predominantly white college in southern Indiana, now known as Anderson University. Our campus pastor at the time, though, was one of the few African-American campus pastors at a predominantly Christian college, and he was a friend of King, so I gravitated to him to get to know him, and that became kind of another interruption. So I say also say we in this journey of whiteness, there were interruptions or opportunities to begin to think outside of my context and to learn and to understand. But that all changed when I graduated from college. I moved to New York City, and to work at a homeless shelter called Covenant House, which was run by a Roman Catholic priest, and lived in a faith community there, Franciscan-style community. And one Sunday, I just realized, man, I'm living in this Catholic community, going to Mass every day, which was very new to me. And I was in this, working at this homeless shelter, which was primarily African Americans and Puerto Ricans and a few whites. And I was just feeling so outside of my suburban white comfort zone that I'd been raised in. I decided I need to go to church and find a church of my own denomination, so at least I would have some comfort once a week on Sunday morning. And so didn't know my way around Manhattan very well, but I found a church of my denomination that was a few subway stops away, and headed north in Manhattan on the A train. And if any of you have been to New York, you know the A train. And I got off and got on what was called the double A back then, the local, and then stopped and went to this church that was at 154th and Amsterdam Avenue. Now, if you know Manhattan, you know that I'm now in Harlem. I am going to try to find a church where I have some comfort in my whiteness, and I'm in Harlem. But I didn't know that. So I arrived at the front door of the church, and the usher saw me, and she said, "May I help you?" Which is an interesting welcome to a church. I said, "This is the Church of God, right? Which was my denomination I had been raised in." And she said yes, and I told her that I'd gone to Church of God College, and so I was welcomed in. And one of the seasoned members of the church got a hold of me and brought me right down front of the church. And it's beginning to dawn on me, this is probably not the experience that I had anticipated. Within a few minutes, the church had begun its worship service, which was they referred to as the devotional service, which was led by lay people. So the pastor was still in his office, and the pastor had heard of my arrival, and I'm 23 years old at this point, and I'm ushered to his office after he's discovered this. And he was from South Carolina, very warm, and had that kind of welcoming hospitality that often comes with folks from the South. And so he welcomed me very warmly and asked me if I was a minister. And I had been licensed because I had been serving as a youth pastor, but had not yet been fully ordained. And so I informed him of that. And he took his calendar, opened it up, and said, "Can you preach for me 2 weeks from today?" I've been told since that I should be grateful that he didn't ask me to preach right on the spot, which often, I guess, happens. Anyway, that began an amazing experience of the year that I lived in New York City, of on Sundays and Wednesday nights being up at this church in Harlem, being mentored and trained by the church in the ways of the African American church, but also having these interactions with folks from the black community, which I had not had much opportunity to growing up. And it was very much an immersion experience. Completely shifted obviously my journey, and began directing me toward the work that I do now. I ended up going to seminary at Howard University, which is an HBCU, historically black seminary. And from there, my wife and I, who's a DC native, moved here to the Twin Cities in the mid-'80s, and have been here since, except for a stint in Chicago that Elena referenced. I say all that just to say that where I started in life did not define where I ended up in the work that I'm doing. So, and I think that's very important for us as we think about the work of racial reconciliation in particular, but even any kinds of reconciliation we might think about, is that we may start in one place, but there's all kinds of room for us to grow in the journey. And I would guess that that's been a part of your story as well. Because I find that these forums, people who often come to these forums are folks that are already in the journey, in the social justice work, doing this kind of work out there. So So I think this is something that we all learn. So I've had the opportunity to be in South Africa on a number of times. And one of the persons there I had the opportunity to meet and develop a relationship with was Dr. Alan Busak, who comes out of the anti-apartheid movement. He and Desmond Tutu were pretty much two of the most active in the protest movement when Mandela was in prison. And Alan Busak comes out of the Reform tradition, and so he shares a lot with Presbyterians. But he's black, mixed race, activist, prophet, theologian. In my engagement with him was post-apartheid, and we began to discuss our concerns about the way reconciliation was being interpreted and at times maligned in our countries. And so we wrote a book called Radical Reconciliation, using the term radical in the way it means, the original meaning, to get it to the roots of something. And we said we need a reconciliation that actually gets to the roots of injustice. It gets to the roots of what divides us, rather than some sort of more surface or kind of interpretation. So as we wrote this book, we decided to look back at really what did the term mean when it was used in the first century by the first century Christians, and particularly the Apostle Paul as he wrote about it. And so as we looked at it, we found out that the Greek term katalasso means to change or to exchange or to switch places. So to change, exchange, switch places. And then we thought, what's the context? Who's using this term and what is their context? Well, the early church at that point, as Paul is writing, are primarily Jews. They are oppressed and colonized by the Roman Empire. If you read the Roman writers of the time, you find really an extreme prejudice against Jews. Basically, some writers would say that Jews were born to be slaves, born to be servants. That was the attitude. So we have in the first century, Jesus and the early church are very much an oppressed, and because this is colonial Rome, colonized people who experienced the prejudice of their overseers. And yet, they're calling for reconciliation. So that's what I want to understand. What does it mean to speak about reconciliation when it really doesn't benefit you, or when it seems counter to what your concerns are? So, to further understand what reconciliation meant is to see how they lived into it. What did it look like? And so I did a close study of the first century church, because whenever Paul writes about reconciliation, he's talking about Jews and Greeks and Romans, or he's maybe speaking about men and women, or slave and free. I wanted to focus particularly, as we looked at racial reconciliation, on the kind of ethnic dimensions. And so what you had Jews who were oppressed, Romans who were a part of the group who were in power and benefiting from oppression, and Greeks also who were dominant culture and benefiting. And so if you look at the first century church, you have what we would call multi-ethnic or multicultural, maybe even multiracial congregations existing, with the language of reconciliation used to describe how this all occurred. The first century churches didn't have, most of you probably know, didn't have beautiful edifices like this. They met in people's homes, and they met in the homes of Jewish people, because all the first churches were formed in Jewish communities. Paul says we went first to the Jews and then to the Greeks and Romans. So what was basically happening was that they would go into Jewish communities and people would become followers of Jesus, and this reconciliation would be a healing process for the effects of colonialism and oppression. And then, and this is kind of my sort of take on this, but there we go. If this can be healing for us, maybe it can help those who are oppressing us, those who are prejudiced against us. And so they begin to invite into the church, and these churches begin to flourish. But they always took place in the first generation in the homes of Jewish people. And so as you think about that, it would be as if today, this arrived in today's context. It would be like Jesus went to the African American community and developed these faith communities, and then we as whites were invited in to North Minneapolis into someone's home for church. And so you can understand the kind of context and what must be happening because there was as segregated or more segregated of a society than what we experience today. Romans and Greeks did not go into homes. Romans in particular did not go into homes of people they colonized. When we see the Roman centurion, why am I drawing a blank on his name? Who Peter visits, Cornelius, and he invites Peter and the folks with him into his home. That never happened. It just did not happen in first century society, let alone going into the homes of those who were seen as beneath you. So this reconciliation was lived, it was visible, people were switching places, as it were, going into the homes. So that was what kind of reconciliation was happening. And the leaders of the first century church were all from the oppressed group, Jewish folk. If you read across the letters of Paul, Acts, and you look for who are the leaders of the different communities. In the first generation, they were all out of the Jewish communities. That's where the congregations were started. So not only have you as a Roman or a Greek gone into the home of someone that's got to be new for you, probably often uncomfortable, now you're sort of under the leadership. So you had to put aside any of your privilege or pride or discomfort or whatever at the door when you came in. But these communities flourished. There was something amazing and powerful about this work of reconciliation. And now in the second generation, you begin to see more Greek leaders emerging in the church, but they've all been apprenticed and equipped out of these first generation home situations. So you see Paul always is bringing a group of folks he's apprenticing into ministry with him, and it's usually a group of both Jews and Greeks, and he's apprenticing them together in these contexts. What I find the most interesting things about this and was the way that it appears that the idea of structural change was starting to be woven in to the first century church. Ephesians 2, it says that Jesus created in himself, through the cross, one new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace, and might reconcile both groups to God in one body through the cross. So the passage seems to be saying that there were two categories of humanity. That's the way people viewed it. That there were powerful Romans and oppressed Jews and other folks that were oppressed in first century first century empire. And what's happening through this reconciliation through the cross that's happening now, lived out in these congregations, is a qualitatively different understanding of humanity is happening. The power and powerlessness structure is beginning to dismantle as people come. And most people who write and study about reconciliation say that reconciliation can ultimately only occur between equals. There has to be a kind of equality developed, and we see that this quality of identity, this quality of what it means to be human is starting to happen. But some scholars, and I would agree with them, suggest that there's actually more than just the transformation of individuals occurring in Ephesians 2. It's speaking to the idea of a new structure being developed. And Paul and the first century disciples of Jesus created communities that prefigure or embody this reconciliation. So in a sense, what's happening in these churches is almost an experiment of what could be happening in broader society, this idea of reconciliation. So let's hold that biblical concept and idea of reconciliation, and let's come back to Minneapolis now and the 21st century. So it's no doubt we're in the middle of what folks are calling a racial reckoning here in the Twin Cities. The racial disparities are some of the highest in the nation. I'm not telling you something I'm sure you don't already know. But when you look at education, housing, wealth, health, just all across disparities, when you take a race lens, the white community is in a far better place than the black community, the indigenous community, Latinx community, the Asian community, other communities of color. And that's been built into our system of how we do things in Minnesota. I heard one activist from the NAACP here say that based on the fact that the studies show that this is one of the best places for white people to live, one of the worst places for people of color to live. And so she said, this is a white Wakanda. If you've seen the movie Black Panther, Wakanda is this idealized society where blacks or Africans, in case of the Marvel movie, are experiencing the best, the ultimate. Everything is pretty much functioning as it should. So for her, saying, I aspire as someone who's black to this kind of society, but the only place I see it is among white Minnesotans, which kind of shows this gap. So in the midst of that, of course, George Floyd is killed in May of 2020, and protest, unrest, and all built out of the disparities for many years as this has been building. And then in the midst of a pandemic, of course, everything is exaggerated and it explodes. And since that time, in the year and a half since, we have been in what folks are calling a racial reckoning. What do we do? How do we respond to now this new awareness or this reminder of what's really going on? So we have some music coming in from somewhere. Oh well. Probably just the angels singing. Anyway, so I'll go ahead. So in a context like this, is it even appropriate to talk about reconciliation? A lot of us are using the language of racial justice, the language of reparations or restitution. Is it even appropriate to talk about reconciliation? I think that if we use a biblical definition, the biblical definition I've just teased out, then it speaks to racial justice. It speaks to reparations and restitution. It speaks to the idea that we cannot be reconciled if we are not equal. And for us to be equal, there's a lot of justice work repair work that needs to happen. And that's what builds that. So if we see reconciliation as a process that includes things like reparations and justice and restitution, then I think we have something we can work toward. So if we think of the idea of if we're in the midst of a racial reckoning, how do we fully understand what's happening in communities outside of the ones that we live in? We have to do what the first century church did, is we have to find a way to switch places, to be in contexts where we can learn, where we can listen, and where we can hear, and where we can see. One of the greatest challenges to the work of racial justice is that we often are so segregated, we just don't have relationships with folks. And that's even more dramatic in a place like the Twin Cities, the state of Minnesota, where communities of color are smaller than they are in other parts of the country or other major cities. But for us to be able to do this work well and right, we have to find ways intentionally. Obviously, we prepare ourselves for. Sure. Well, just as a summary, um, we've looked at the fact that we all can step into this work in some way, form, or fashion. That we all have room to grow. We all can. It's a part of the human experience, which is actually a beautiful part of it. That the New Testament reconciliation is much stronger and much more justice focused than what we often hear today. Because a lot of times people use the language of reconciliation and it's heard by people as assimilation. Oh, I got to become like you. Or it's seen as weak. But this was language used first by folks who were being oppressed by the Roman Empire. And they saw this language as something that could address the reckoning. I mean, you could, this would make a good sermon some Sunday, but say that Jesus and early disciples were creating a reckoning within the midst of the Roman Empire about what justice looked like. And we saw that in the first century church, that it was illustrated as people went into the homes of Jewish folks. We see that this model was an apprenticeship model where leadership was trained up under those who were had been oppressed, and that there was an element of structural change already beginning to occur as these new communities developed. So I think that we can be about the same kind of work here, that in the racial reckoning that we're currently experiencing, we need to do a lot more exchanging places, getting into communities and learning from. I know that you have opportunities to do this here. I know that some folks from Westminster were a part of the 21 Days of Peace initiative, which is actually now 100 plus days in motion, where folks went into, particularly in the north and south side, but also in St. Paul, and the communities where there's a lot of violence, and stood in solidarity. But not only stood, actually sat, ate hot dogs, got to know people, built relationships. That's that kind of same idea of switching places. Welcoming Afghan families or other refugee families is a great way to step into a community that's switching places kind of in the other direction, because they've come and they've got to find a place, but also to get into those experiences. And then I think I was at the end saying that we're on this journey now of trying to look at what does it mean to do reparations, which we feel begins with truth-telling. We need to understand the history of racism and how it's harmed folks, how it's created these great inequities that we have to address. And then we have to look at the system currently and how it continues to harm. And then we need to address that. And reparations is one piece. It's not the whole piece, but it's one piece. And reparations we look at reparations theologically. So we not only think of reparations as money going to the black communities or land going returned to indigenous communities, but it's addressing all the ways that racism has harmed communities of color. With that, hopefully the online audience is hearing me and be open to any questions that you might have or comments. A couple here.
My question, you use the term reparations. Now, so that, what I always thought, and I think you verified this, is money, somehow or other money will go into the black community or somehow. I mean, I guess I'm not sure how that actually is used, that money. And
Sure.
is that okay?
Yeah, so there are, like I said, we use the bigger concept of what does it take to repair. And obviously, economics is a piece of that. But the way we're operating on this is that we are building relationships in black and indigenous communities and asking community leaders, and this will be a long process, but to define for us what's needed in your communities to help repair and address the great gaps that are there and the great injustices. So in some cases that will be money. There are some books written that do the math at the loss of income because of slave labor and because of years of segregation, that look at the effects of housing because of redlining, et cetera, look at the health and they have the actual numbers. And so I do think at some point, whether it's a move of government or business or foundations, whoever, there's going to have to be economic investment. But I think it's more than that. In indigenous communities, you hear more about economic issues as well, but you hear more about the importance of land and culture. So these are all still being debated within communities themselves, what this looks like. Most likely, it'll be a combination of things. And right now in the Twin Cities, there's a number of black business leaders that are working with their white counterpart CEOs and businesses, putting together sort of what they call wealth creation kind of work. The Bush Foundation has set aside $50 million to go into black communities and $50 million to go into indigenous communities. And they're now waiting for local communities. They have a process set up to select an organization. And that would be used toward supporting actual individuals. Maybe it's home ownership, maybe it's college education, but it's again moving that money into the communities that need it and then finding mechanisms that are effective over a long period of time. More than just sort of a one-shot sort of infusion of money, but let's build structures that help communities get healthy and stronger and viable. But that's a good question because that's often how it sounds or is heard.
Thanks so much. I would like to hear more about practical ways we can engage in the process of exchanging places. We know Minneapolis has been intentionally designed by the white community to keep us segregated. Many of us live in homes that were that have a history of having a racial covenant attached to the deeds, which prevented us from having integrated communities. So tell us more about how we can engage in this process of exchanging places without our siblings of color paying the price for our education.
Right. Good question. I do think that, I mean, it's a good example of the idea of restrictive covenants. So right now, there's most of the information that we need to learn is out there. Jim Crow of the North is a great documentary that talks about restrictive covenants here. So I think that part of this exchange of places is an exchange of knowledge. We have to gain a knowledge about how systems happen, history. We're, along with many others, trying to do this at the Minnesota Council of Churches with kind of a truth-telling work. We also need to become educated, and I expect that Westminster is farther along than some congregations in just being able to understand how racism works, the power dynamics, what does it mean to be culturally competent, et cetera, et cetera. But all of that's here. And it also needs to get to here, to the heart, to the relational folks. So we have to begin to set up ways to have interaction, again, as you point out, that's not taxing on or expecting folks of color to carry the load. So I think as organizations figure out how to do this, so I think church partnerships that begin to bring relationship. Again, this 21 Days of Peace, which has just sort of started bringing in white congregations, but I was on Broadway and decided to drive around and look at a couple of the other sites beyond the one that I was looking in. I saw black and white people sitting at picnic tables, again, sharing hot dogs and stories and just having this sort of chance to relate and to share and to begin. And I think we have to consciously and intentionally create these kinds of moments and opportunities. And it's easier to do it if we as groups, whether it be congregations or organizations, take on the work of trying to set those up. But again, it's not beyond the possibility of individuals just going out and finding community contexts where they can just be and get to know. What I am against is what I call drive-by relationships, where I as a white person see a black person go, you're going to be my friend. That's not how it works for us. I mean, we are in groups. We connect with folks that we sort of have feel some sense of kinship with, and we develop relationships. So it's getting ourselves into context, not just ourselves, our children, our youth, but if congregations can figure out how to do that, I think that's a really good way down the path. But I think we try everything. I hope that I think this can. One thing that Elaine didn't mention, but I taught at Bethel University for a while, and reconciliation studies there. But one of the things we were trying to do is get all these Christian students to know some Muslim folk. And so we worked with the Muslim Student Union at the University of Minnesota to develop some opportunities to engage. We worked with some local mosque college groups. So I think where you can put folks together in group kind of context, then it happens more naturally.
I just wanted to share a little experience we've had in our family. Our oldest daughter married a covenant, he's ordained covenant minister, and they just intentionally moved into the north side of Minneapolis, and where there's a lot of lovely homes being restored that were once Jewish homes, Anyway, I feel they've really grown, and we've watched their success. They involve themselves in the community and go to the community meetings and even do some protesting if needed. And, and then my daughter also started a little preschool thing in their recreation center. And so she's helping in what ways she can with her time. And she sees the need for, like daycare stuff and that too. But anyway, I just think they got immersed, and they go to their block meetings, and it's a mixed neighborhood now that they're in that section. So they've done a lot to help that community.
Yeah, you can move in.
So it is possible to do as a family level. And their 3 kids went to all the public schools and did just fine there. And graduated and finished college,
Yep. We live in South Minneapolis. We have, neighbors of various, come from various communities. And yeah, it's when you're in a neighborhood, you're walking the sidewalks, you're talking to people. The goal is to try to find, I mean, you have to be intentional to kind of initiate this, but to get yourself in context where it becomes natural. I mean, that was the beauty, I think, of the first century church is folks were in someone's home. And you just know when you're in someone's home, it's going to have a different kind of feel to it. Also, you get to know people in a different way. A lot of us who are white know people of color when they come into white contexts, but we don't go into contexts where folks of color live. But yeah, when we got married, if we're married, we go to our spouse's house, their parents, to get another look at who they really are, see how they are in their home context, to get the fuller picture, not just in our context. So I think that's an important part of finding ways to get ourselves into context. It was a great example. Thank you.
We had a system here in our country quite some time ago when we drafted people into the military. And I'm from the same background that you're coming from. And being drafted, the third day I was there, I saw and talked to the first colored people I had ever met in my life. But over time, you learn that we're the same and you have to depend on each other. And when President Nixon decided that we're going to eliminate the draft, he eliminated the big culture mix that we had going on in our country. And that was a real solid foundation of building friendships and enduring time with each other.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the whole, again, with the draft, you didn't have any choice, but you got there and you had to make it work. And so, I mean, and that's the other thing that I appreciate your point. Not only when we get ourselves into racial mixed context, do we understand the differences, but we see the similarities, which are much more than the differences. People are raising children. People are, working jobs. People just, there's so much that's similar. Yes.
I read the business press a fair amount, and since the murder of George Floyd, there's a lot of articles about diversity people being hired and grants and things going, and some of the big banks organizing now to bring a Black-owned bank into the community because they're not going to. So it talks about systemic change, but I keep wondering if, as a person of faith, what are the church leaders doing? Are there any of these kinds of conversations going on among church leaders? Because, like you said, you don't want to be a drive like I'm going to go make a Black friend, or like, is there anything that church leaders in this Twin Cities area are thinking about systemic change and how we can do something as people of faith? I don't know, maybe that's kind of an ambiguous question, but I wonder about reading in the newspaper about business leaders doing all the stuff for justice. It's like, where is the church leaders talking about justice?
Right. No, that's a good question. In fact, the church is perhaps one of the most segregated institutions. So we have often the least interaction with each other. But there is work being done, and ministers are gathering and talking about these issues, not just for protest, but for how do we move forward on this? How do we support what's happening? In the case of the Minnesota Council of Churches, and we were already in this process before George Floyd was killed, but we have intentionally, because we're a majority white organization, a majority of our member denominations are white-led and majority white. The 4 historic Black denominations that are here in Minnesota are all members. And so we initiated, and in essence, put ourselves under the leadership of the Black denominations, knowing that then at our board meetings that would change the conversation and the agendas, and it has definitely done that. And out of that, then when George Floyd was killed, we were already in a journey, and that just sort of then accelerated our programmatic side around working around truth-telling reparations, but also our governance side. And so now we have a board by adding a number of at-large slots. We now have a board that's majority Black, Indigenous, people of color. And we're just now beginning to live into that. Elena is one of our board members, newer board members as well. And what's going to happen now at the board is that there's going to be a kind of interaction with church leaders that rarely happens, which I expect then will kind of move across the various denominations. There's a lot of good intentions, a lot of aspirations, and the challenge is to take that and then make something real happen. So it's happening, and I would just say in your downtown world here, the downtown clergy in the last couple years has become way more diverse than it's ever been. Plymouth has an African American pastor. First Covenant has an African American pastor. Elena is on staff, a part of that. Fellowship Missionary is a part of that. Imam, why am I drawing a blank on Imam's last name? Akran, yeah, Makram Akran, Elamine, yeah. So if you'd looked 5 years ago, it's a very different picture. So the leadership here, and as leaders begin to interact, then ideas spawn, partnerships develop, and of course, it's amazing. It's not only just interracial; it's interfaith. With Marcy Zimmerman's very strong voice in the mix as well. I think we're running out of time, so thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you this morning.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. DeYoung. We're grateful that you've been here and called us to get to the radical roots of reconciliation. We ran out of time, but I really would have liked for you to say a little bit more. So we hope you will come back and help us understand what reconciliation looks like when it's costly. That's what we want to know about. Next week, we will welcome Reverend Ana Kendick Flores. She is the Presbytery of the Twin Cities Area Anti-Racism Institutional Assessment Coordinator. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for those of us who joined us on the live stream.